Yeah, I can turn down the lights. Turn down for what? No. How's that? Better? Okay. The risks being I turn down the lights, everyone starts to fall asleep. We don't want to do that. All right, so today, reproductive system. Our goal with the reproductive system is understand the functions of the male and female reproductive systems in general. What do they do, right? What's the function of the system? How do they work? We'll identify the similarities of the male and female systems, all right? And then we'll explain how the endocrine system helps regulate reproductive function. So we just finished the endocrine system last semester, went through a bunch of hormones. We'll talk about the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis and how that controls reproductive function, especially in the female. And we'll identify the reproductive organs and structures of the female system. And then we'll get through the various stages of ovarian follicles. So that some of you are already looking at this and you're going to understand this particular slideshow is shorter than what I gave to you. I gave you more slides, right? We'll go through all this stuff. I omitted a bunch of the text slides, right? We'll talk about it as you'll see as it goes through, but follow along. All of the slides are there. They're just going to be separated out, right? Does that make sense? Because you have 15 slides in there that explain each and every stage of the uterine cycle. I don't need to go all through all of them, right? They're there for you to read and go through, but I don't need to go over them in class. Because I'll talk about them, but I don't need to have them in there, if that makes sense. All right, so let's get started. Male and female reproductive systems. What do they do? What's their point? Those of you who had lab for me today, what is the goal of the male and female reproductive system? To do what? You said that in lab.
But this time you didn't say personally.
I said male and female reproductive system. Singular. So, system. Nice try. Right? So separately, the male and female reproductive system do what's the purpose? To do what? To produce gametes, right? To produce gametes for reproduction, okay? So gametes, that means sperm and egg. That's the purpose of the systems separately, okay? And so to do that, the systems have a way of providing for sexual maturation. We're not born ready to have babies, okay? So the cells for procreation are gametes, right? So those are our gametes. That means sperm and egg, right? There are obvious differences between male and female reproductive systems, right? We have internal genitalia for females, external genitalia for males. Gonads in the males are outside of the body. Gonads in the females are inside the body, right? There's plenty of differences that are present, okay? There are some similarities, all right? They are what we call homologous or somewhat homologous structures. I just realized you guys can't read that, so I'll do this. Is that better? Okay, so there are clear and obvious differences. There are similarities as well, right? Obviously, one similarity is that both systems produce gametes, right, that are used cells for reproduction. And those cells are produced through the process of meiosis. Okay, another similarity is that they both consist of a system of tubes that will move those gametes around. Okay, and some structures are derived from primordia, which means there are homologs that serve a common function. Example of that being the clitoris and the glans penis, right? Those are both similar organs right? The clitoris and the penis and parts of the penis are homologs, right? Table 28.1, this one right here, here it gives you your homologs. The ovary and the testes are the gonads. They produce the gametes. The clitoris and the glands of the penis. Labia minora in the body of the penis, the labia majora in the scrotum, right? There are areas of skin that help to contain erectile tissue, etc. Right? They are common, similar functions, right? And the greater vestibular gland, the bulbourethral gland, they secrete mucus for lubrication for sexual intercourse, right? So there's some similarities in there, right? Now you can identify several similarities between the male and female system, okay? Other common elements, right? Gonads, they produce a large amounts of sex hormones, right? And what sex hormones are we mostly talking about? So let's like close. Let's call them steroid hormones. That what hormone is mostly associated with males? Testosterone. Okay, and then in females we have estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so abbreviate that T, we abbreviate estrogen, and then progesterone is abbreviated P4. Okay? Both sexes have accessory reproductive organs, right? Both sexes undergo sexual maturation, otherwise known as puberty. Okay? And then they involve in sexual union, right? Copulation, coitus, sexual intercourse, however, some of the terminology for it. Puberty, right, is the process of becoming sexually mature and be able to produce gametes that are viable and can produce a pregnancy or capable of reproduction. Okay, so this begins during adolescence, right? This happens when hormones in the body, specifically the hypothalamus, GnRH, starts to be produced at a higher level or more regular level, which induces the production of FSH and LH from the pituitary, and then that stimulates the production of estrogen and progesterone in females and testosterone in males. Those sex hormones then start to initiate the process of sexual maturation, and sex characteristics develop, right? Enlargement of the breast in females, widening of the hips in females, hair growth, right? Pubic hair, body hair, all begins to occur. And this is when gametes begin to mature. And at that point, individuals are mature enough, oh no, that's the wrong word, are physically mature to have and produce and reproduce, right? Have children and reproduce. And this is controlled by the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis in a ways that I just went through, right? The hypothalamus produces a hormone that targets the pituitary, and the pituitary produces a hormone that targets the gonads. The hypothalamus produces gonadotrophic releasing hormone, otherwise known as GnRH. Okay, that increases in production and targets the anterior pituitary. Okay, and in response, the anterior pituitary produces luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. LH and FSH. And both of these hormones, LH and FSH, they function in males and females and have kind of different purposes. FSH does what it's named for, follicle stimulating hormone, right? It's going to stimulate the growth of follicles in the ovary. So in females, this is just the sign for females, right? It stimulates follicle growth. Now, you may have heard that females are born with all of the gametes or the eggs they'll ever have. So how are follicles grown if they already have all of the eggs that they are born with? Well, that's true. They are born with all of the eggs they'll ever have. Okay? But every month during a normal cycle, several of those oocytes are recruited. The cells around the oocytes develop into a follicle, and then eventually that follicle ruptures and releases the oocyte into the reproductive tract for potential pregnancy. Otherwise, the ovary just stays, the oocytes just stay in the ovary, nothing happens. The hormones that are produced by the follicle don't do anything. They don't prepare the uterus for pregnancy, and nothing ever happens. Does that make sense? So the process of recruiting and developing a follicle is imperative to allow ovulation to occur, to release the oocyte, and also prepare the uterus for a potential pregnancy. So that stimulates follicular growth. And in males, well, what's the follicle in males? What would you consider to be the analogous structure to a follicle in males? What do you think? So if I stimulate a follicle in order to release the oocyte, what is produced in Grace?
Testicle?
Oh, that's the gonad. What inside the testicle is produced? Sperm. Sperm are the analogous structure, right? So we develop the follicle in females for FSH. In males, it's important for sperm production. Now, luteinizing hormone in females is the signal. The hormone is released at a low, steady level up into a certain point, and at that point, it goes really high, really quick. We call it a surge, right? It goes high really quick, and then about 12 to 24 hours after that release, ovulation occurs. So LH in females actually induces ovulation. Okay? And in males, there's no analogous ovulation that happens, right? But instead, it targets interstitial cells. These are cells between the seminiferous tubules to produce testosterone. Okay? So, how does this, so then if we think about the hypothalamic pituitary axis, right, the endocrine control of the reproductive system, let's look at how does this endocrine control the reproductive system in females? Well, GnRH controls release of LH and FSH. LH will induce ovulation, and that's necessary for reproductive release of the oocyte, and that's important for reproduction. Yes? Without FSH, right, is released in response to GnRH, and that helps to induce, right, growth of a follicle, development of the oocyte, and maturation of the oocyte, of the gamete. Okay? Same thing for males. Sperm production is dependent upon FSH and LH, right? So LH, we know over here, produces testosterone, but there's other cells that utilize that testosterone that's produced to help drive sperm production. So without either of those, sperm production doesn't happen. So the hypothalamic pituitary axis is imperative in controlling reproductive function. Okay? And if you mess with it, if you disrupt it somehow, reproductive function is disrupted. Last semester, you may have, during lab, you may recall a lovely case study of the endocrine system of someone named Chad. And Chad was abusing anabolic steroids. How would abuse of anabolic steroids disrupt the male reproductive system?
Would it affect sperm growth?
How?
By blocking it?
Okay, how? Okay, so yes, you're right. It's going to stop sperm production, but like, how would having this anabolic steroid that mimics testosterone stop sperm production?
The body will naturally stop producing its own testosterone, so it will be unable to produce.
Right? So the body's going to see this. Remember, this is regulated by a negative feedback loop, right? So the anabolic steroids are testosterone analogs. They're going to trick the body to thinking that testosterone is really high. Okay, great. Testosterone's really high, but in the testes, there's no testosterone. That make sense? So, but the body's not going to produce, it's going to shut off the GnRH production. It's going to shut off the LH production because the body thinks that testosterone is really high. So LH is shut off, GnRH is shut off, and in response, FSH is also shut off. So without FSH, no sperm production. Okay? And then how would we rectify that? Remove the exogenous steroids. The body would lower the testosterone levels, recognize that, and it should start up again. Okay? How might hormones disrupt the normal ovulation cycle in a female? This is kind of the basis for hormonal birth control, right? So hormonal birth control tends to be estrogen and progesterone and some mix of those, yes? Well, if estrogen is really high and stays high, guess what happens? You don't do what? You don't produce the LH, okay? So if you don't produce the LH, what can't you do? You don't induce ovulation. So no ovulation, no oocyte. Then you remove the estrogen, replace it with progesterone, okay, really quickly. Guess what? Then you go and then you remove the progesterone and then cycle starts over again. But you're just hormonally stopping ovulation. That's one way of hormonal birth control acting, okay? So the hypothalamic pituitary axis is imperative in regulating reproductive function.
If estrogen and progesterone are very high, would that stop both LH and FSH or just LH?
It would stop both because they're feeding back on the system and will stop it from happening. Right? One at different times of the cycle, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay? So most of the anatomy I'm going to leave for lab. Here's a female pelvic region, right? So we'll get into the female anatomy. Gonads are the ovaries, and they're connected by a system of tubes, right? What we call Mullerian ducts that develop into the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, the uterus, and the vagina. Okay? So the ovary sits low within the pelvis, and then on top of that, kind of right here, you have part of the fallopian tube kind of covers it, and it will catch the ovulated oocyte. There's finger-like There are some finger-like projections that are called fimbriae. Right, that's these right here. The fimbriae kind of cover, and it goes into the ampulla, right, the turn, and eventually down into the isthmus that attaches to the uterus. right? That's the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. The purpose of the uterine tube is to transport the oocyte to the uterus. The uterine tube is also the most common site for fertilization to occur, right? For fertilization to occur, it has to happen, in pregnancy to be established, it has to happen within a certain window, right? So that fertilization happens commonly in the uterine tube and then implantation within the uterus, right? So that development of the zygote is at the right stage for implantation in the uterus to occur, okay? If it happens too early, the developing zygote can implant inside the uterine tube, which is a problem. What is that called? Anyone know?
Ectopic pregnancy.
Ectopic pregnancy, right? The tissues of the uterine tube are somewhat similar to what's in the uterus. They can support the zygote implanting, but it's not big enough, it doesn't stretch, etc. So, but that can be really problematic. Can be a life-threatening situation if not taken care of. Okay. The cervix is the area of the this part of the uterus that separates. Is the separation between the interior part of the uterus and the vagina, right? The uterus has 3 distinct layers. The perimetrium is the outer surface. The myometrium is the muscular layer in here, right? And then the endometrium is the inner lining that develops every month, right? In a normal cycle, in response to the hormonal cycles that are present, and without the presence of a pregnancy, will slough off during menstruation in females. Okay? And then we have the vagina, which is the copulatory organ, right, and the birth canal for females. Right, here's the perineum. It's just kind of an area, right? So we have the urethra is anterior, the vaginal orifice is medial, and then the anus is posterior. Right, and we have a couple different triangles. The anal triangle is the area between, around the anus and to the parts of the pelvis. All right, and then the urogenital triangle is from the clitoris to the parts of the pelvis. Right, and then the whole area is the perineum. Internally, the structures of the female reproductive system are held in place via a number of ligaments, right? So they're kind of sandwiched between with a ligament that goes from side to side called the broad ligament, and it holds kind of holds the uterus in place, also holds the fallopian tubes and the ovary. There's also an ovarian ligament, which goes out to the ovary, and then a round ligament that holds the ovary and part of the fallopian tube in place. Right, a suspensory ligament holds the fallopian tube in place. So this isn't just kind of like moving around. It is in a distinct area of the pelvis. Now, within an ovary, right, an ovary, the gonad, has a distinct structure. All of the oocytes are located around the perimeter of the ovary in a part we call the cortex, right? So all of this stuff out here in this area, right, that's all the cortex. And this stuff in the middle, this area in yellow is, let's do it, can you see it in green? Nope. Let's do it in dark blue. How's that? That area, well, that actually works well. All right, that area is the medulla. All right, so the cortex is out here, right? That's the cortex, right? And that's where most of the follicles and the oocytes are, and that's where they will develop. And in the middle, in the medulla, is where you have blood vessels and connective tissue that help support the tissues of the ovary. All right, outside of the cortex, there is a connective tissue structure called a tunica albuginea, which kind of surrounds the whole thing. All right, and this is also showing you kind of where this is in terms of the uterine tube, right? So what we're missing here is that, imagine having a part of the uterine tube come out like this, the fimbriae cut and cover the whole thing. Does that make sense? So we're just cutting that out, and so you can see kind of uterine tube versus the ovary. Within the ovary, there are follicles, and we can stage the follicles based upon some characteristics, and they develop from like oocytes that have not been recruited at all prior to puberty, and then they will start to be recruited some every month. Okay, a few every month, and then eventually one ovulates, right? So all the follicles that are prior to being recruited are called primordial follicles. And their structure is this. They kind of look like these right here. These are primordial follicles, right? They're circular, but they have a dot or something on the inside. That dot is a polar body, which is a result of the process of meiosis that occurs prior to birth, right? So those are arrested in one of the stages of meiosis, and they will stay there until closer to ovulation, and then eventually finish meiosis during fertilization. All right, so they're stuck in a suspended state of animation, right? Just kind of stuck in that way until they are activated. Okay, then those primordial follicles, once they're exposed to hormones such as FSH, right, and estrogen, they start to grow, right? So this right here is your first stage, your primary follicles. So you'll go from a primordial to a primary follicle. Every month, several of these follicles are recruited, right, and they start to grow. You'll notice that the primary follicle, the characteristics larger than primordial follicles, and there's a layer of cells that surround the oocyte, okay? That layer, one layer of cells, is what defines a primary follicle, okay? Before that, you didn't have a layer of cells kind of surrounding the primordial follicles, and they were kind of small, okay? As the follicle is continued to be exposed to FSH, it continues to develop from primordial, right, from primary to secondary follicles. And the defining characteristic of a secondary follicles are multiple layers of cells that surround the oocyte. Okay? Those multiple layers of cells are starting to develop. They're being exposed to hormones, and in response, they're releasing hormones. This is the structures the cells that release estrogen. Okay? So as a follicle gets bigger, what happens to the amount of estrogen that's produced? Bigger the follicle, the more estrogen that's being released. Does that make sense? So think about kind of like where this is, this growing part of the ovary. What's growing in this part of the ovary? A follicle. This is what we call the follicular phase of the ovary. Okay? The follicular phase, the follicle grows, right, and gets bigger. This happens between day 0 and day 13, day 14. Okay? So we go from a secondary follicle and then becomes an antral follicle where we start to develop this thing, right? This thing right here, this blue area, that is the antrum. The antrum is a fluid-filled cavity inside the follicle. It starts to separate cells away, so the cells that surrounding the oocyte are starting to be separated. Some stay around the oocyte, others are on the other side. And eventually, that antrum fills with fluid and becomes a mature follicle. And that's what you see here, right? This is the antrum. It's filled with fluid. Okay, this is a mature follicle. It's also called a Graafian follicle. It's also called a tertiary follicle. All those are synonyms. Any of them are pre-ovulatory follicle, if you want to say that. Right? All of those are correct. Right? This is a mature follicle. It is ready to be ovulated. It's producing lots of cells around it, well-defined antrum in space, and producing lots of estrogen. What's the question? Which one? This one? Tertiary. Tertiary. And this one is Graafian after the Graafian. All right, Graafian named after the scientist who characterized the follicle. So what happens now is that we're about day 13 of the follicular phase. And at day 13, all this estrogen starts to go up and then it starts to come down a little bit. And when it comes down, that's when the LH surge happens. And we know LH surge induces what? Ovulation. So here's what happens. That follicle ruptures and it expels the oocyte into the fallopian tube. All right, and it kicks out the oocyte, and any of the cells that are surrounded, associated with the oocyte, go with it. All right, so here's the oocyte, it's been ovulated. All right, there's the cells that are surrounding it are called the corona radiata. All right, and then the oocyte has a distinct, at this point, very distinct protein structure that surrounds the oocyte. That's called the zona pellucida. All right, you can almost make the analogy that the zona pellucida is like the eggshell of the oocyte. Okay? So this follicle has been exposed to LH. There's been a rupture that happens, and now the question is what happens to the cells that remain in the ruptured follicle? They've been exposed to a high level of estrogen and then LH, they've changed, right? Their behavior is going to change. And with that, they go from these follicular cells into what we call luteal cells. And the structure is no longer a follicle, it's now a corpus luteum. Okay? So we've gone day 0 to 13 follicular phase, development of a follicle, it's gotten bigger. Eventually, we move day 14, ovulation happens. And now, day 15, after ovulation, this huge change that occurred. Now we move from the follicular phase into what we call the luteal phase. And the controlling structure in the ovary is no longer the follicle, it's the corpus luteum. Right? And those luteal cells, they don't produce estrogen anymore, they produce progesterone. Okay? So you have this corpus luteum that is producing progesterone that is important for preparing the uterus for a potential pregnancy. Okay? And that progesterone will stay high for a period of time. If there is no pregnancy established, right, there's no signal to maintain the corpus luteum, it will start to die off and start to regress. And it'll go from a corpus luteum, which means yellow body, into a corpus albicans, which means white body. Okay? And the corpus albicans doesn't produce any hormones. The cell, it's basically kind of a scar tissue, right? Of what the remnants of what was a defining corpus luteum for a period of time. Okay? And then after the regression of the corpus luteum, we'll start the next cycle, and another group of follicles will be recruited. All right, so what we've done, we've gone through the phases of what we call the ovarian cycle. Right? So the ovarian cycle is the cycle that the events that occur in the ovary during a monthly female reproductive cycle. Okay? So the first phase was what happens first? Primordial follicles, and we're going to start to grow a follicle, right? That's what we call the follicular phase. And that's days 0 to 13. Okay? And that is characterized by growth and development of follicles. All right, so the follicles develop, produce lots of estrogen. What happens next? Eventually, one follicle gets really big, and what happens? Ovulation. That happens around day 14, right? And that means what happens is the oocyte is expelled as the follicle ruptures. Okay? And then finally, after ovulation occurs, we move from those cells that are left over become a corpus luteum, and now we go from the follicular phase to the luteal phase. And that goes days 15 to 28. Right? And then the corpus luteum produces progesterone to prepare for potential pregnancy. Interesting. That is the ovarian cycle. Okay? We have not talked anything about what's happening in the uterus. All right? We haven't talked about the endometrium or anything like that yet. Right? The cycle, the normal reproductive cycle in females is directed by what happens in the ovary and the hormones that are produced by the structures in the ovary. Does that make sense? Yes? Now, do you talk about the ovarian cycle in terms of when you talk about someone who, reproductive cycle in females? No, you talk about what? What's it called? What's it more commonly called? Menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is really talking and characterizing events that happen in the endometrium, right? Or in the uterus. That is not that is not separate from the ovarian cycle, but it's dependent upon the hormones that are produced by the ovarian cycle. All right, so follicles, different types of follicles, went through each one. All right, so here, what do we have here? So if we're right here, say, I think that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's day 14, because that's what's happening right there. Ovulation. So what's this phase called? That's the follicular phase. And what's B? Luteal phase. Jackie. Okay. Okay. So that gives you a kind of an idea of what's happening. If I were to graph, let's say I wanted to characterize the the relative amount of estrogen that's going to be produced, right? It's going to be pretty low here. Is it going to go up or down? Up. It's going to get bigger, right? It's going to get like that. Yes, and then it goes down right here a little bit. Okay? And then it kind of comes up and stays kind of pretty level throughout the luteal phase. We'll call that estrogen. Okay, in red, let's do progesterone. Progesterone is going to be really low during the follicular phase, right? Why? Why is progesterone low during the follicular phase? Is it produced by the follicle, or is it's not produced by the follicle? Right? Estrogen is produced by the follicle. Progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum. I think that's what you were getting at, right? So we're here, now ovulation happens, progesterone comes up like this, and eventually drops down. Does that make sense? It's high during the luteal phase because the corpus luteum produces the progesterone. What if we did LH in purple? Say low, 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 then what? It's going to have a spike right before ovulation.
Before or on?
Before. About 12 to 24 hours before ovulation happens, LH spike. Right? And then it comes back down to low. All right? There you go. I didn't put FSH. Look at FSH in there. So everything's lined up for you right there from days 1 through 28. Right? We have ovulation at 14. Look at here's day 14, just before day 14. Day 13, there's a spike in LH. There's a little spike in FSH, but that's not really the main culprit, right? That's not really the main contributor to ovulation. LH is. Questions on the ovarian cycle? There's your estrogen and progesterone levels. Why does estrogen increase up to and at ovulation? Because the follicle is growing in size. Follicles get bigger, more estrogen produced. It drops down because ovulation occurs, and that's when progesterone comes up. Here is an outline of meiosis and the structures of the ovary, right? Oogenesis is the process of producing the oocyte. It is meiosis, right? And meiosis starts with a diploid cell and should end with 4 haploid cells. However, in the production of an oocyte, that doesn't happen. You end up with 1 oocyte that's produced and multiple polar bodies, right? Polar bodies are the little spots on the oocytes, right? It's condensed DNA as a result of I don't want to say incomplete meiosis, but stopping the production of meiotic divisions along that pathway. All right? This shows you the relationship between the hypothalamus, FSH, and the ovarian cycle. This is a nice little infographic of the stuff we just covered. Right? So GnRH, FSH, LH, FSH targets, increases follicle size, follicles get bigger, more estrogen. Ovulation occurs, and we move from follicular to luteal phase, right? That feedback shuts off the LH, FSH, right? Progesterone slows things down, and then we move through the luteal phase, right? And that's just another picture of anatomy. Questions?